The hum of the aging engine was a familiar lullaby, a constant companion to the miles that stretched out between the aching familiarity of my hometown and the quiet, salt-laced air of the seaside town I had begun frequenting. My name is Elise Vance, and my life, until recently, had been a tapestry woven with the muted threads of routine and responsibility. When my father, a man whose lifeblood was his thriving delivery business, found himself frequently away on extended trips, it was I who stepped into his worn work boots. The chipped paint of the delivery van, the rumble of its chassis, the weight of invoices, these had become my world. Lately, these duties had taken me to a particularly picturesque yet unassuming coastal village, a place where the rhythm of life seemed dictated by the tides and the cries of gulls. It was here, amidst the weathered storefronts and the scent of brine, that my world began to tilt on its axis, all thanks to an encounter that would redefine my perception of myself and others. I was making a delivery to a small shop, one I had visited a few times now, when I first truly noticed the person who ran it. My initial impression, a fleeting judgment based on outward appearances, was that I was meeting a young woman. Her attire was striking, a flowing skirt that seemed to capture the essence of the sea breeze, paired with a top that was both stylish and comfortably casual. Then she spoke. The voice that emerged was higher, softer, with a melodic cadence that, in my hasty, unobservant state, I attributed to a youthful femininity. I delivered the goods, exchanged pleasantries, and drove away, the image of this effervescent shopkeeper etched into my mind. It wasn't until days later, back in the predictable quiet of my own life, that the memory resurfaced with a peculiar insistence. The way she carried herself, the easy confidence that radiated from her, the sheer unself-consciousness of her style. It was also different from the hesitant, almost apologetic way I navigated my own existence. The seaside town, with its unique charm, had introduced me to Michael, though at the time I hadn't even known his name. I had simply known a presence that was unlike anyone I had encountered before, a beacon of self-expression in a world that often felt defined by conformity. The memory of that initial encounter, marked by my embarrassing misjudgment, would return to me often, a quiet reminder of the assumptions we make and the hidden depths that lie beneath the surface of every individual. A lesson I was only just beginning to learn. My subsequent deliveries to the seaside town became less about fulfilling my father's business needs, and more about a burgeoning, quiet anticipation. With each visit, the mystery of the shopkeeper began to unravel. The initial assumption I had made about Michael's gender dissolved swiftly, replaced by a dawning, somewhat disorienting realization. This individual, the one I had mistaken for a girl, was indeed a boy, Michael. He laughed and said, "People confuse me all the time like that. But I'm me." He was indeed himself. He was the owner and operator of the shop I visited, a fact revealed during one of my more extended conversations with him. He possessed an effervescent personality and natural charisma that drew people in. There was a playful flirtatiousness about him, a light-hearted teasing that never felt malicious, but rather like an invitation to engage. What struck me most profoundly, however, was his fashion sense. It was a world away from my own hesitant attempts at style. Michael embraced clothing with a bold, uninhibited flair. He wore skirts, not as a costume or a statement, but as a natural extension of his personal aesthetic. The very items that girls at my school declared made me look ugly. He wore colours, textures, and silhouettes that I had always shied away from, convinced they would highlight my perceived flaws. Driving home after these visits, the quiet confines of my van became a space for introspection, a place where the internal monologue often turned critical. I found myself dwelling on the stark contrast between his effortless self-possession and my lifelong insecurity. The words "ugly duckling" felt like an indelible label, a truth I had long accepted. How could this boy, Michael, possess such a natural beauty, such an innate sense of style, when I, Elise Van Zaa, had always felt so out of place, so aesthetically challenged? Yet, amidst this self-deprecating comparison, something else began to stir. It was a nascent feeling, a subtle but insistent tug at my heartstrings. The way Michael looked at me, a plain city girl, not with judgment, not with pity, but with a genuine open curiosity, sometimes with a spark of amusement, sometimes with a warmth that felt personal. It awakened something within me. As the miles dissolved beneath my tires, the sounds of the ocean waves and the chirping insects outside seemed to recede, making way for the insistent, pounding rhythm of my own heart. A question began to echo in the quiet spaces of my mind. Why, now, does my heart yearn to be heard over the waves and insects when he looks at me? It was a question laced with a warm confusion and a hidden longing. This yearning extended beyond a mere admiration for his style or personality. It was a deeper, more complex desire. Why do I maybe comparatively wish to be a little like him, appearance or by personality? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was a silent acknowledgement that Michael represented a possibility, a different way of being, an invitation to explore facets of myself I had long suppressed. The seeds of fascination had been sown, and they were beginning to take root in the fertile ground of my quiet, unexamined life. The frequency of my trips to the seaside town began to increase almost imperceptibly at first. Then, with a deliberate, conscious effort on my part, I found myself volunteering for deliveries with an eagerness that surprised even me, extending my reach beyond the times my father was genuinely away on business. My father, a man whose gaze was increasingly fixed on the horizon of retirement, saw my increased involvement as a positive development. He was a practical man, always keen for me to gain more work experience, to absorb the nuances of the trade he had built. He saw my dedication as a sign of maturity, a young woman taking on her responsibilities with diligence. He was, in his own way, delighted. Little did he know, my motivations were as layered and complex as a well-aged vintage, and his perception of my ambition was merely the uppermost, most palatable surface. Beneath that, my true drivers were far more personal, far more centered on a single captivating individual, Michael. My desire to see him, to be in his orbit, was the magnetic force pulling me towards that coastal town. Each delivery route, each invoice processed, was merely a convenient, socially acceptable guise for my burgeoning obsession. I craved his company, the way he effortlessly embodied a self-assuredness that I found myself desperately lacking. I wanted him to be my guide, not in the technicalities of delivery logistics or inventory management, but in the far more challenging, ethereal realm of self-discovery. I wanted him to teach me, by his example, how to shed the heavy cloak of self-consciousness that had clung to me for so long. I yearned for him to show me how to embrace a little more individuality, a touch more outgoing spirit. The lessons I sought from him weren't found in textbooks or workplace training manuals. They were etched in his playful banter, in his vibrant choices of clothing, in the way he moved through the world with an unashamed authenticity. I imagined him as a living, breathing embodiment of the person I wished I could be, as someone who wasn't afraid to stand out, someone who understood that true style came from within, not shot from conforming to external expectations. My father's approval and his business, these were secondary. Those ostensible reasons were swept aside over the languid days in my own town. My reason was proximity to Michael, to absorb his essence and, perhaps, to learn the secret of his unburdened spirit. I was a moth drawn to his light. This secret, I believed, held the key to unlocking a more vibrant, more true version of myself, a version that could perhaps one day stand as an equal, not a pale imitation, beside the captivating boy from the seaside. Despite my earnest efforts, the metamorphosis I had secretly hoped for, the one that involved shedding my old skin and emerging as a more confident, outgoing version of myself, never truly materialized. The whispers and sidelong glances from my classmates persisted, their mockery morphing and adapting to my every attempt at change. If I tried to adopt a new style, they'd scoff, calling it trying too hard. If I dared to speak up or express an opinion that deviated from the norm, I was branded as weird. The sting of their ridicule, which I had anticipated and even braced myself for, somehow failed to land with its usual force. It was as if my emotional armor had become too thick, or perhaps my focus had shifted to a far more critical battleground, one waged within the quiet chambers of my own heart. The realization struck me with a clarity that was almost startling. The desire to change myself, to fit the mold that my peers seemed to idolize, was slowly but surely fading in importance. What was truly consuming my thoughts, what was occupying the vast landscape of my mental and emotional energy, was an overwhelming, undeniable need to see Michael. His presence, his energy, the sheer vibrant existence of him had become the sun around which my world now revolved. The external validation I once craved from my classmates felt hollow and insignificant compared to the potential validation, the mere acknowledgement I yearned for from him. I wanted to see him more than I wanted to be someone I wasn't. This realization brought with it a poignant sense of bittersweetness. It was freeing to let go of the pressure to conform, yet it was also deeply unsettling. My internal compass had swung wildly, pointing towards an unknown destination, a place where my own authenticity was paramount, but where the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty. The most pressing question that gnawed at me was whether Michael reciprocated this desire for connection. Did he wish to see me? Did he see me at all, beyond the role of a delivery girl or a pleasant contemporary? The vulnerability of this position was immense. I had stopped trying to impress others, but in doing so, I had become acutely aware of my own perceived shortcomings, my inability to break free from the ugly duckling persona that Michael's very existence seemed to highlight. I was adrift, anchored only by the hope that Michael might see something in me worth noticing, something beyond the reserved, awkward girl who delivered packages to his shop. The calendar pages turned with a relentless certainty, each day bringing summer's end closer, its golden warmth gradually yielding to the crisp, cool embrace of autumn. It was on the eve of this transition, the final day of summer, that I found myself drawn back to the seaside town, to the familiar path leading to Michael's shop. I wasn't even delivering anything that night, only myself. A subtle shift had occurred in the atmosphere, a palpable change that wasn't solely dictated by the changing season. Michael, the usually effervescent, bright-eyed shopkeeper, was different. The usual spark in his eyes seemed dimmed, his demeanor quieter, more subdued. He wasn't his usual cheerful self this time, and a gentle melancholy seemed to cling to him, like the sea mist that often clung to the coastline. I didn't probe, didn't ask what troubled him. Perhaps it was the quiet understanding that had begun to develop between us, an unspoken acknowledgement of each other's inner worlds. Or perhaps it was simply my own intuitive sense that some burdens were best borne in silence or shared only through quiet companionship. Instead, I found myself simply standing beside him. We didn't speak much, our conversation reduced to a few soft murmurs, the rhythmic pulse of the waves providing a natural, unobtrusive soundtrack to our shared silence. Together, we watched as the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon. The sky transformed, a breathtaking spectacle of color, that bled from vibrant oranges and fiery reds into softer pinks and purples, slowly deepening into velvety indigo. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of salt and distant pine. It was a moment of profound, almost sacred peace. The world around us seemed to pause, held captive by the sheer, unadorned beauty of the dying day. In that shared stillness, I felt a sense of vulnerability, an openness that was both fragile and profound. It was heartbreakingly simple, yet it carried an immense weight. Witnessing Michael in this quieter, more introspective state, I realized that even those who seem to possess the most radiant inner light, those who exude confidence and express themselves so freely, carry their own burdens, their own dreams that remain tethered to the earth. I thought to myself, with a quiet certainty that settled deep within my soul, that even people like him, people who seem to have it all figured out, who shine so brightly, still harbor secret aspirations. They, too, want to spread their wings out, to explore beyond the familiar confines of their immediate surroundings. They, too, yearn to see the world beyond the seas and skies, to move the wind and clouds with their breath, to create waves of change around them. It was that moment of shared humanity, the want for growth, for adventure that I recognized inside of him, and now within myself. As the last hues of twilight faded, giving way to the star-dusted canvas of the night sky, Michael finally broke the comfortable silence that had settled between us. His voice, though still carrying its melodic undertone, was laced with a new wistfulness as he spoke of his own desires. He confessed that he longed to travel more often, to see the places that existed beyond the familiar shores of his seaside town. A flicker of something akin to envy, quickly tempered by his inherent good nature, crossed his features as he admitted, almost sheepishly, that he was a bit jealous of me. You get to see so many places, different towns, all because you're a delivery girl, he said, his gaze drifting towards the distant lights of passing ships. At least you get to experience the world. His words struck me with a peculiar resonance, for I had never viewed my delivery routes as an adventure or a privilege. To me, it had always been just chores, a series of obligations my father occasionally assigned, a monotonous task list to be completed. I had never stopped to consider the broader perspective, the opportunities for exploration that lay within my routine. I never saw it that way, I admitted, my voice softer than I intended. It's always just felt like work, chores my dad made me do occasionally. He let out a soft laugh, a sound that was both warm and tinged with a familiar playful teasing. That's such a typical Elise thing to say, he remarked, his eyes twinkling, though there was no malice in his tone. Boring, like your style. He wasn't making fun of me, not really. It was the easy way of how people talk around here. I didn't hear anything anyways. I was only captivated by the genuine spark returning to his eyes when he spoke of his dreams. A bold idea, one that felt both terrifying and exhilarating, began to form in my mind. It was a fragile thing, a budding hope that I almost hesitated to voice, fearing it might wither under the harsh light of reality. But the pull towards him, the desire to connect on a deeper level, was becoming too strong to ignore. Gathering a courage I didn't know I possessed, I turned to him, my heart thrumming against my ribs like a trapped bird. Hey, I began, my voice a little shaky. When I come next time, maybe you'd want to come with me. I paused, my cheeks flushing, emboldened by this sudden reckless impulse I didn't even know I had. I mean, I added, my gaze meeting his, even if I'm not making deliveries. Just to see a different place, maybe. It was a tentative offer, a carefully worded invitation that hinted at a desire to share experiences beyond the normal nature of my visits, a step towards bridging the gap between our disparate worlds, and perhaps between our hesitant hearts. The night had deepened, the moon casting a silvery sheen over the quiet seaside town. Michael's gaze lingered on me for what felt like an eternity, a prolonged moment charged with an unspoken understanding. His floral dress, a cascade of vibrant petals against the darkening backdrop, seemed to billow gently in the breeze, mirroring the unsettling turbulence that had begun to stir within me. My heart, that old betrayer, started its familiar, erratic, flip-flopping dance, a physical manifestation of the nervousness and burgeoning affection that always accompanied looking at him for too long. It was a sensation I was becoming increasingly accustomed to, yet it never failed to catch me off guard. Then, with a grace that belied the earlier quietude, he turned, not towards the bustling street, but towards his shop, a small, unassuming building that held within it a world I had yet to discover. He beckoned me to follow, and without a second thought, I did. He pulled me into his room, tucked away behind the retail space, and I stepped into a sanctuary of sorts, filled with a comforting presence of secrets revealed only to me. There, standing proudly against one wall, was a guitar, its polished wood gleaming softly in the dim light. Beside it, a piano, its keys a silent promise of music yet to be played. "This is what I mean, you know," he said, his voice carrying a new depth, a resonance that seemed to emanate from the very soul of the room. He didn't elaborate, and for a moment I was unsure of his meaning. Then he sat down at the piano, his fingers finding the keys with an instinctive familiarity. He began to play. The melodies that filled the small room were not just notes, they were emotions translated into sound. Though I might not have possessed a finely tuned ear for musical intricacies, I could feel the story he was weaving. There was a profound sense of loneliness in the plaintive chords, a deep ache for connection that resonated with my own unspoken feelings. Intertwined with that loneliness was an undeniable longing for freedom, a yearning to break free from the constraints of his current life, to explore the vastness that lay beyond the horizon. It was a raw, unvarnished expression of his inner world, a world far more complex and sensitive than his outwardly flamboyant persona might suggest. When the last note faded, leaving a lingering silence that was somehow more eloquent than any words, he looked at me, his eyes holding a newfound vulnerability. "Maybe one day I'll get big," he confessed, his gaze returning to the keys. "But it's hard to get around here, growing up in places as small as this town." It was a confession that laid bare his dreams and his struggles, a window into the heart of a boy who felt trapped, yearning for a life that stretched beyond the confines of his immediate reality, a reality that I, in my own quiet way, was beginning to understand and, inexplicably, to want to change for him. Fueled by the raw emotion of the moment, and perhaps a touch of recklessness born from the intimate setting and the depth of our conversation, I found myself blurting out a promise, a bold declaration that felt both utterly uncharacteristic and strangely inevitable, like I took a long, pleasant walk just to get here. "I'll take you out of here," I said, the words tumbling out before I could have fully processed their magnitude. The instant they left my lips, a wave of heat washed over my face, and I felt an overwhelming sense of embarrassment. The phrase sounded incredibly cheesy, even melodramatic, like something ripped from the pages of a romance novel. I immediately wanted to retract it, to shrink back into my usual shell of quiet reserve. But Michael's reaction stopped me. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss me. Instead, he considered my words with a seriousness that surprised me, his admission more profound than any of his usual flirty responses could have been. He looked at me for a long time, a thoughtful expression on his face, as if weighing the sincerity and the possibility behind my impulsive statement. Finally, he spoke, and his response was laced with a quiet resolve that offered a glimmer of hope and nervousness. "When my dad gets better, I'll sell the shop." He paused, then added, "Then I'll think about coming and going to sightsee with you afterwards." My breath hitched. He was considering it. Not just considering it, but making concrete plans that hinged on my offer. A surge of adrenaline, a mixture of elation and disbelief coursed through me. Even if it wasn't exactly what I hoped for, I still at least would get a revolutionary friendship out from my offer. Then, with a little smirk that softened the seriousness of his words, he turned back to me. Besides, he continued, his gaze playful yet earnest, someone has to help you look better, and it might as well be me. It was a playful jab, a gentle tease, but it was delivered with a warmth that dissolved any potential sting. It was his way of accepting my offer, of framing our future adventures, one where he would guide me as much as I would show him the world. And then, he added something that felt like the final, pivotal piece of the puzzle, something that completely made it clear to me what he felt towards me. And from now on, he said, his voice dropping slightly, a hint of determination in his tone, I want to be called Clara Chen instead of Michael Chen. The name hung in the air, shimmering with a new identity, a clearer reflection of the person he truly was, or aspired to be. Clara Chen. I repeated it silently, committing it to memory. In that moment, bubbling feelings popped in my stomach, like a can of fizzy orange soda being cracked open. I felt a little dazed, but he, or she now, took my hand. The touch grounded me back into her room, surrounded by her dreams, and brought a new chapter of my life. One that promised that now our dreams were merging into one.